So who are you and what do you do?
I'm Nick Bostrom. I am a philosopher, I guess, and I was until recently a professor at Oxford University, where I was the director of the Future of Humanity Institute.
Yeah, you decided to leave. Have you decided to leave academic, or how were you saying where you're at now?
Yeah, well, so I've been running this since we created it in 2005, and it sort of started small, then grew, and then in the last 4 or 5 years faced increasing administrative headwinds. Um, but in the meantime, there has sprung up a rich ecosystem of many different groups and organizations that are now enabling work in these areas that FHI was created to do, which is to think carefully about these big picture questions for humanity and the way that particular emerging technologies might pose major challenges. And so AI has been a big focus for many years, and like you could almost say an obsession. And of course, now that's completely mainstream. Um,
Yeah.
and similarly with some of the other topics that we were sort of early adopters of.
There's a lot of people who think the previous book, Superintelligence, was really more focused on the existential risks that we could face with AI and other forms of technology, and how Deep Utopia is spinning it into what happens if this works and what type of life we have. Do you feel that that's a fair comparison? And was that intentional in terms of trying to show both sides of the argument in a different way? Because I feel like each book still is interspersed with both sides of the argument.
Yeah, certainly the Superintelligence book focused more words, more of the pages on what could go wrong. Whereas Deep Utopia doesn't really talk about that at all. It just analyzes the ways that different human values could be realized to extreme degrees, or in some cases, the ways in which this condition of a solved world would pose challenges for some human values. But it's not so much that my views have changed. I haven't done a flip flop, as some people have alleged. Both the upside and the downside were always there in my own thinking as realistic outcomes of this transition to the machine intelligence era.
Yeah. It feels like the conversation is less about whether it's good or bad. It feels like the contention is really somewhere along timeline in terms of how soon this might happen, how radical it might be. I think a lot about Yuval Noah Harari, who talks about the challenge being the intermediary years, where it might be so dramatic that we see a rise in massive unemployment, which would lead to maybe a semblance. Historically, we've had this of more extremism, which creates a lot of anger and resentment, and then the change in politics. Is the timeline argument the one where you think most people are stuck, or do you think there's a fundamental argument about whether or not this technology will be good or bad? And I say that somewhat sarcastically because it feels to me that whenever we have something new at scale, the invention of fire, fire is good and bad. Technology is good and bad. Electricity can be good and bad. Are we not seeing something? How do you think about those types of conjectures?
I think there are several conversations and debates happening in parallel that have some linkages, but there are just more than one important question here. So one is, as you said, about the timeline, where I'm kind of towards the end of relatively short timelines, or at least having significant probability mass on this transition to the machine intelligence era happening relatively soon. We don't know, but I think we are now in a position where we can't even very confidently rule out extremely short timelines, like sort of a year or two. But I think it probably will take longer. But we can't see we can't see enough further obstacles that we can be confident that whatever obstacles remains couldn't be overcome in a short period of time. And then there's, in parallel with that, this conversation between sort of the doomers and the accelerationists, which seems to be rooted in different opinions about how likely it is that superintelligence would cause a catastrophe. Because obviously, the lower you think that probability is, the more likely you are to want to accelerate things to reap all the benefits. But if you think it's like basically game over as soon as we develop superintelligence, then you might hope to delay this as long as possible in the hope of some sort of miracle happening in the intervening time. And so that's one conversation. And then I guess there is like a geopolitically focused conversation, which sees AI as this big lever of power, and who will be able to grab it. And this then feeds into the rivalry between the US and China. And then there's like a business conversation, like is there like a sort of .com like bubble happening with the AI, Nvidia stocks, etc., or is this are there kind of enough profits that are going to come over the next few years to warrant the current evaluations? And a bunch of other conversations as well. But I think those are kind of all there, and to some extent, different communities are like focusing on one of these often. But I think they all kind of there's a bigger context in which all of these different strands have to fit in somehow.
So what's that context? What's the conversation from your side that should be point one?
Well, I'm interested in the overall macro strategic situation for humanity, but basically the question of how do current actions people can take today relate to long-term outcomes for humanity, which is really hard because like it's hard enough to know what the consequences are even over a short time span in many cases. But if we are thinking about the ultimate fate of humanity, that those linkages are often even more indirect and sort of hidden in the mist of ignorance. But nevertheless, unless we have some sort of informed opinion about that, it seems to me like that we are just flailing. So getting more clarity on that. For example, in the current situation, do we want more government involvement and regulation, or like nationalizing AI projects, or do we want to ward that off? It's a big question. The answer is not at all obvious. But to find the answer, one might have to address a whole bunch of these different uncertainties at the same time, because they all link up. Like what so for example, your views about the timelines, your views about the rivalry between the US and China, your views about how hard it is to align superintelligences from a technical point of view, and a bunch of other things all kind of come in to inform your opinion about what should be done.
Can you help people who may not be thinking about this, forget like you, but even at the level of intelligence that you're thinking about this at, understand what makes this one so different? So the context I'll give you is people will say to me things like, oh, Mitch, you're being too dramatic about all this AI stuff, because think about how we went from nothing to a steam engine, or how we went from a steam engine to computers, or computers to an internet. And there's something itching at me, and maybe I can't even put my finger on it myself, that says this is very, very, very different. And then the other angel or devil on the shoulder would say, oh, that's what you do. You get sometimes over dramatic about it. How do you think about it, Nick? From a more simple way, is this that dramatically different from any other massive shift from technology adoption in our society? Because I feel like it is, but I have a hard time vocalizing it.
I mean, you could say that it's the most general purpose of all technologies, in as much as once you have superintelligence that is then, amongst other things, really good at inventing technologies and can invent them sort of on digital timescales, that then really it's not just AI you have all technologies advancing at sort of digital superintelligence speeds. And in fact, not just technologies, but other like innovations in institutions and in strategies and long-term planning and many other things. So that's why maybe one way to sort of make it plausible that it's a kind of qualitatively different from all the other things that people get excited about. Oh, the mobile internet or the cloud, or like every few years there's like another hype concept that people have to put in their PowerPoint presentations, right, to get investors and employees into. But I think AI is not like one of those. I think it's like insufficiently hyped rather than overhyped. You might maybe analogize it, if you're going to find some historical comparison, perhaps rather to like the rise of Homo sapiens in the first place, rather than to any particular thing that has happened through human history.
I like that. It's interesting too, because you talk about the digital mind and the biological mind. And I think the area that I keep circling around, similar to that, is this idea of we could have to redefine what the word intelligence means. And that, in and of itself, has a massive cascading effect, even beyond just education, how we think about it. But this idea, and again, maybe it's the ego in us, finding the humility to say, we might be able to create something more intelligent than us. And by doing that, it might be the reality that our brains aren't as complex or as smart as we thought. And there's something irritating in that, I think, to a population.
Yeah, I think we have seen some of these sort of humbling moments, like with chess, maybe was the first one. And actually, maybe before that, just calculating big numbers in your head, like that used to be really impressive. If you could multiply, you know, 6-digit numbers, just like, but then of course, calculators could do better than chess. Like that used to be the epitome of what we were impressed by in terms of human intellectual achievements. And more recently, I guess language use, like a facility with words, is something that I think we have taken pride in, and that now, I mean, it's still in limited ways, but just the facility with which torrents of words can come out that are, you know, often very, like, not just grammatically correct, but kind of flowing quite neatly, and probably outdoing 90% something of humans who are trying to write stuff out. But ultimately, yeah, I think AIs will surpass us in all intellectual domains, including philosophy, for example, and other forms of sort of, you know, creativity, wisdom, scientific insight, common sense, emotional empathy, like the ability to read human emotions. In all of these things that are ultimately sort of, we perform them by doing complex information processing in our brains that will be done more efficiently by machine brains.
Do you think Nick Bostrom 2004 would think or say the same things as Nick Bostrom 2024? Meaning, to a certain degree, I look at this and think, I worry about what my kids might do or their future, but at the same time, I feel, being of middle age, that this may not impact me as much as I think, or might it not? Does that work into your calculus at all? This dramatic idea, like, I wonder if a 21-year-old Nick would be okay saying these things as easily as a middle-aged Nick or Mitch.
Well, which specific things?
This idea that it's going to be better at, let's say, philosophy than I
yeah,
could
I
ever
mean,
be.
that seems like that became kind of clear to me sometime, probably, you know, when I was 15 or something like that. It was just a matter of time. And then a few years later, it kind of shifted my intellectual orientation. So I'm kind of been interested in these big fundamental questions, whether they are in physics or philosophy or other areas. But it did seem to me at that point that we should, or at least I wanted to focus more, as it were, with philosophy with a deadline, because at some point over some number of decades, I figured we will be outdone either by AIs that are smarter than us, or maybe some kind of cognitive enhancements that would be done on humans, and that our current intellectual efforts therefore would become obsolete, unless they could produce results that would be relevant before our intellectual obsolescence set in. So yeah, there are a lot of questions that it's benefits to having the answer a little bit earlier than later. Like maybe some of these kind of ultimate questions about the true nature of reality, or like that philosophers have been thinking about for 2,000 years, maybe we could sort of hold off on getting the answer a few more decades. It doesn't seem that pressing. But some other questions where I think philosophical inquiry could be relevant, we really need the answers in the intervening years. And so those are the ones that my work has focused on. And in particular, this includes questions that we need to answer to get this transition to the machine intelligence era right.
Yeah. Why do you think? Let's take the creative industries as one example, and I'm often faced with this being the fact that I'll straddle between the marketing, business, and tech worlds. This idea of a great idea cannot be predicted. A great idea cannot be. There's all these factors. I mean, I struggle with that as an answer, but it still seems to be the general trope we're hearing out in the world. Is that just a function of what I would call the elites? Is it something that we just hold on to because otherwise, where is my value? Where is what I've contributed? How do you feel about those who just feel this idea that creativity is only a function of the humans? I find it absurd, but I'm curious where you stand on this.
Yeah, I don't think there is like this dichotomy between the creative and the other things we do with our brain. I think it comes on a continuum. um, and we see glimmers already of creativity in AIs. There was this like famous Go move in when AlphaGo,
Right.
the DeepMind system, was playing Lee Sedol. There was one move that initially sort of stunned the expert human observers. It made no sense. No humans would ever have played there. Then it turns out later in the game that that's precisely this move that sort of unlocked the winning strategy for the AI. I think it's fair to say that there is an element of creativity in that. And similarly, lower grades creativity, if you just go to ChatGPT and say, write me a poem about a bird who steals like a golden ring, like it will come up with something. Maybe it's not great poetry, but it's like, it's a little bit creative. Like it's maybe better poetry than most people would write and more creative. And so I think it then goes from there. Every little everyday instance where we solve some problem where we haven't specifically been told the solution before, I think involves rudiments of creativity, putting together general principles or other things we have observed and sort of figuring out what follows from that, coming up with some plan is
I fully
creative.
agree. Yeah, I mean, I'm bad at titling articles, and I find that ChatGPT, which happens to be the tool I'm using, is actually much more creative than I am when it comes to figuring out a title that I want it to be witty but professional. It does a very, very good job from my side. And then I'm often wondering if, again, is there a difference between someone who can write and a writer? I have a podcast where I interview bass players, and I often say anybody can play bass. It's pretty hard to be a bass player. But maybe that skill level changes as this becomes more pervasive. And I feel like that's the friction that people have, right? It's this, when is it, what is it? And then, if I've worked hard at a skill and suddenly I've discovered that it's so easy to do, what does that say about me? It seems very personal to people how they take this.
Yeah, and I think like with the image generators, we kind of see this, like there are people who, learn to draw, they're pretty good at it, and and then now you just type in the words and you get like some sketch that's like, in many cases superior. I think maybe it makes people question the value of some of these skills, but people still play chess and people still do a lot of things that machines can do better, but we don't have to do them for different reasons. Not because they're sort of functionally useful, but because we maybe find them intrinsically valuable or we enjoy them.
You go down that road with me a little bit, because this was one of the things that I really enjoyed digging into in Deep Utopia, was this idea that productivity for leisure, not consumption, creates a different type of world. When I think about it simplistically, I think about Star Trek. It's like, oh, you want to be the captain of a spaceship? You can do that. Nick, oh, you want to be a farmer at a vineyard? You could do that. And the system takes care of it because it can handle all those other things. We've seen science fiction become reality countless times. But do you think that this leads us to a place where we literally have that societal shift where we're not constantly thinking about things like consumption, things like accumulation of what? Do you think that is the net of this? Or do you think we'll just always have our personality traits that are driven by those types of needs or wants?
Well, I think if things go well, and we do realize this condition, I think we will have sort of post-work society where people don't need to work for a living, and because there is nothing that would be economically useful that we could contribute. And there might be some marginal cases we can discuss, but at least a first approximation. AIs and robots could do everything better. So there would be sort of full unemployment. But then I think it goes deeper than that, because there are a lot of things that we do and need to do today that fill our days aside from getting a paycheck. Like wealthy people are often busy doing stuff. And in some cases we need, like Bill Gates has to brush his teeth, right? Otherwise he gets tooth decay. And there's like just a bunch. If you want your home decorated in exactly the way you prefer it, you probably have to put in some time and attention to select the style and to but all of those things as well, I think at technological maturity would be done more efficiently by machine. So in the Star Trek scenario, like, yes, the AI could also captain the spaceship, and in fact, if some human insists on sitting there in the captain's seat and moving, this would just kind of make things work less well, and they just mess up. So they could do it for entertainment, but it wouldn't actually help the mission.
Do you, with your experience, Nick, do you think people have the ability to deal with a transition like that? Are you hopeful that society can make that leap, or is that where the concern lies?
I think so. Like, I think it will be require a big reorientation of culture to focus on like to create a flourishing leisure society, because so much of human society from time immemorial has been based on the assumption that there is a whole lot of work that needs to be done, otherwise we starve and we freeze. And so from the way we are educating our children in the current era, basically placing them behind, training them to be productive workers. Like they have to sit still, do as what they're told, hand in their assignments, they are graded, and it's all based on the idea of, there's like kind of rhetorical flourishes about developing their full personality, but in reality, if you look at it, a lot seems to be to create sort of good office workers who will do what they are told diligently and follow instructions and be able and willing. But like in this scenario, you wouldn't need that. You could focus the education system on raising people who are great at enjoying life, and maybe cultivating the art of conversation and appreciation for opera and art. Be able to take great pleasure in food and wine. Appreciating nature, playing games, like just developing, great skills at complex games and inventing games, and like there's just like an infinite other way of being human that we haven't had the opportunity to develop very much, but which we would have the opportunity to do to develop in this scenario where we attain sort of a post-work society. But if we stop our thinking there, I think we are still relatively naive to what's happening, because ultimately human nature itself will become malleable. So it's not just we will be confined to what we are now, and the technology will sort of bring us more stuff and do the work, but we ourselves, our own bodies and minds, will become subject to choice, our mental states. And so that then raises much more profound philosophical questions about what we ultimately want, what ultimately we think has value.
And what do you think that is? If you were to kick that stone a little bit further down the hill, what do you think that is? What do you think we'll discover at the end? That maybe we are just here to repopulate? That it's just simply about that? Or do you think there's something more to it?
There's like a bunch of and this connects to more traditional moral philosophy, where people have for hundreds of years tried to analyze like what's the good human life, what has value. And so there are different theories about that, but one can kind of go through the list of some of the most common elements of those lists and see whether they could be instantiated at technological maturity. And for a whole bunch of them, the answer is clearly yes, to an extreme degree. So take first pleasure, just actually enjoying the life, like having subjectively positive mental states, which is really important, in my view, for the future to go well. is that its inhabitants are actually having a good time. But this would be trivially easy to do at technological maturity with various forms of brain manipulation technologies, whether it's like some super drugs without side effects or direct, interfaces with the brain, or re-engineering of our neural architecture, or genetic engineering, or like uploading, and then you have full control over the architecture, like a whole bunch of ways. So I think you would have approximately the ability to select your mental states as you wish. So so to the extent that you're a hedonist, like, it's really good news, because you could attain unimaginable levels of bliss, and not get bored after a little while, like the current. Like, you could take like some big, and, and like some heroin injection or something, like, and maybe you get the big high the first time, and then you get addicted, and then a smaller high, and then eventually probably your life ends up being like much more miserable than it would have been if you had never done it, because we habituate. Same if you win the lottery, like the first day ecstatic, and then, but that's like a feature of our current neural architecture that you could change with mature technology. But then you can go beyond that. So you
Technology
have,
helps us end chasing the dragon, is what you're saying.
sorry,
Technology helps us end the concept of chasing the dragon, as it were.
yeah, or this hedonic treadmill, like
Right.
we could stop it. Um, um, and I think probably we would want to, because like, why have all this misery and dissatisfaction if it's no longer needed? I think we could do much better. So that already might be enough to make it to Utopia. But you could go further. So rather than just imagining these, I don't know, like a sort of blissed out junkies splayed on a flea infested mattress, like having great subjective pleasure, but otherwise very humdrum lives, you could imagine adding to that. So rather than just having sort of a drug like pleasure, maybe they, like these utopians, could take great pleasure in appreciating beauty, or in understanding deep truths about the universe, or praising goodness. So you could add experience texture to this, and they might have much clearer perceptions and thoughts than we have, that
And
they
there's
would
a,
then take great pleasure in.
I wonder if there's an argument, though, that would play into this idea of, if you're thinking about strong mental health, everybody would love to be anxiety free. But the truth is, in order to have happiness, you need to have that balance. Are you saying
Yeah.
that technology solves for that? That's maybe just a programming error from us initially? What are you saying?
I'm not even sure it's true for us now. As a general rule, I think what is true, I think, is that if we right now got full root access to our minds, like imagine some sort of soundboard with different controls, but for the different levels of neurotransmitters, we probably would make a big mess of it and go like crazy, or become addicted, or some, because you need skill and wisdom to do that kind of stuff well. But I don't think there is this kind of exact equation that you need to have a certain amount of pain in order to have a certain amount of pleasure, that some people say. I mean, I know certainly people who vary quite a lot in their natural temperament. I have a friend who is never seen him bored or anxious. He just seems to be happy and excited and interested in all kinds of things. And there are other people who are like chronically depressed. Maybe they go their whole life just being kind of, with subdued mood, and feeling kind of anxiety and depression. So there is no natural or metaphysical law that says that you have to have one to have the other, it seems to me. Certainly not in any kind of proportion.
Well, some might argue that you need that deep level to create something genius, right? The tortured artist would be a great analogy of that. You're saying that could very well just be a story, a myth.
Well, I think there are certain forms of genius and art and literature that have come out of great human suffering and sort of processing that. Maybe it would be possible to sort of imitate that without having the subjective experience. But even if it were not, let's say that the cost of Utopia were that we wouldn't have any more, I don't know, Guernicas, or any more King Lears. I mean, we already have, I think, enough of these artworks to, if you really want to sort of contemplate misery and tragedy. Like, I mean, you just how much more it is. If that's the price of like everybody living happily forever after, that we have slightly fewer of those tragedies and maybe we have more comedies instead, I say go for it.
I'm with you. I'm with you on that for sure. So we had a moment in time, and I think it's hard to argue that the publicness of ChatGPT sent us on this real massive tilt. Did you see that moment in time the same way as the rest of the world did? Do you feel like that was the quote unquote killer app that opened it to everybody and that we're seeing the result of that? Or do you see it differently, that there was a time continuum, but it seems like this, it's just a product and the life cycle of what we're doing here?
And I think it was a pretty big step, these large language models and the transformer architecture, like a kind of in a way surprising that you could get the level of performance that we see, particularly in coding and language understanding, without yet having full artificial general intelligence and superintelligence. That there's this stage sort of seemingly very close to full like AGI that can talk and do all of these things, but yet slightly short of it. And that's evidently lasting for several years, right? Because that's how long we've had them. That is not something that was obvious ex ante, that you could have AIs passing the Turing test without sort of next week being super intelligent or like.
Yeah.
But I think AI has been on a tier since 2012 roughly, when the deep learning revolution started. Things just seem to start to fall into place, and since then we've had a relatively steady sequence of really impressive developments. I mean, maybe initially not so impressive to the general public, but in terms of just showing that there was a bunch of stuff that previously were out of, like just being able to recognize objects in images used to be really hard, like vision.
Right.
For AI systems. For decades, researchers were working on this, trying to handcraft systems, and then you have these learning algorithms that just learns to do that, to tell a cat from a dog. It seems trivial now, but it was an elusive goal. And a lot of the human brain is perception. Like if you just count the number of neurons, like a lot of them is dedicated to processing visual information and auditory information. That's a lot of what our brain is doing. Now suddenly you could do that. And then you had these reinforcement learning systems that DeepMind developed that could learn to play a whole range of different Atari games out of the box. So not just learning to sort of categorize input, but also learning to perform, like learning skills and to plan. With AlphaGo that we alluded to earlier, you see this reaching a kind of, and exceeding peak human ability of deep pattern recognition in the game of Go. So that was a big milestone. I think like AlphaFold kind of built on that, and then these LLMs that show that even language and sort of common sense is something that follows as you scale up these transformer architectures and give them enough data.
Is it clear to you where we go with artificial general intelligence with AGI? And the reason I'm asking you this is you mentioned the Turing test and this idea of it is now officially able to fool us. Good. Is it truly more intelligent than us? Not just predictions off of databases. There's this sort of weird, but it's that space in between that I'm so curious about. Like, who cares? Who cares if it's just fooling us or if it's actually more intelligent? Doesn't it stop and end with the idea that it fools us? So that's good enough. Like, why? I'm very curious about this thing where people are like, oh, they kind of downplay the Turing test, and then they're like, oh, but we're like decades away from AGI. And I'm like, what's the difference if the output still makes me feel like it's either a human or just as smart as a human?
Well, when we say the Turing test and it can pass it, like it depends a little on the version of the Turing test. So if you have sort of experts asking the right questions, you can suss it out. And but what we really have is kind of the current AI generation is really good at doing basically everything that we humans can do in a very short period of time. So like what we can do in 1 second, that's basically the perceptual system. And now you can have sort of sentences and paragraphs generated sort of tasks on that time scale. What they haven't yet really achieved is the ability to do as well as humans in longer range tasks, like kind of projects that might last for a day or a month or a year. They sort of get stuck or go off the rails a bit when faced with these. That requires kind of planning, and there is just less data of humans. Like when you're doing a very short range task, that human perception is kind of 100 milliseconds or something, and spewing out sentences one by one is also so you can get a lot of feedback, right? So that AI can try one thing and you have like kind of almost infinite data. You can try it and see what happens. But if it's like run a country, right? Like there's not big data sets of like try to run a country for a few years and then we see what happens, right? So it's a lot harder to train AIs to do those things.
Yeah, and even if we have them, they may not be the best data, which is another argument.
No, but that's also true for the text stuff. If like you just scrape the internet, there's a lot of suboptimal content.
As we know from Reddit and ChatGPT, right? Exactly. So tell me a little. I'm sorry. Go on, please.
No. You go ahead.
I'm also curious about. So we talked a little bit about OpenAI and ChatGPT being this moment in time, and I think we both agree that it was very big. You have Sam Altman, though, who comes out and says that there is an extinction risk to this tool. There was two trains of thoughts. Maybe there's more that I'm happy to have you share with us. One was easier to say you want to be regulated than have to be regulated. Some thought it might just be hyperbole hype to get people thinking about it. And then some people took it exceptionally seriously. How do you think about that? Because it's pretty dramatic to have, I always accustom it to, you have a fight at the high school with the bully, and the little person who's about to get destroyed by the bully is screaming, hold me back, don't let me go, don't let me out. And his friends are like, you better not fight. Like it gives me that analogy when I think about it.
Well,
how do you think about it?
I don't think it was that. I don't think it was like an attempt to whip up interest and hype. I think it's rooted in a real appreciation for what ultimately the consequences will be when we succeed at superintelligence, and including the understanding that there will be significant risks, including existential risks, that we will confront.
But existential isn't extinction, or might it be?
Is like existential is like this concept. I actually coined it back in 2002 or something. So which is the set of ways in which we could permanently destroy our future. So that includes extinction and also other ways that we could sort of permanently lock ourselves into some radically suboptimal state. If you imagine a sort of global totalitarian oppressive dictatorship that you could never overthrow, that would just remain with us, that even if it's not extinction, it might be roughly as bad as extinction.
Yeah, you're enslaved. Exactly.
So it's like this slightly broader category of catastrophes. But they all have in common is that you don't get a second chance. Like we can't learn from experience to avoid existential risks because we only get one shot. So yeah, I think there will be some of these existential risks associated with the AI transition. Nevertheless, I think we should develop superintelligence. I think it's a portal through which humanity will need to passage. And we need to be really careful when we do it. But I think all the paths to really great futures ultimately go through this portal of developing greater than human cognitive capabilities. And I think that's like, and a lot of the key people at the Frontier AI Labs have actually been quite engaged with the consequences of what they're trying to invent from an early stage, much more than one might naively have expected from like most businesses in the business of making money, and that's more or less all there is to it. That they might have some sort of greenwashing, but I think a lot of the people who have been leaders in AI actually do take this larger responsibility seriously and have some appreciation that they're not just developing another cool technology, but something much more profound.
It's nice to hear that, Nick, because I think the media or the perception of the media that we receive isn't that. It's this idea of, oh, we're getting rid of our safety things. That makes a big headline. You have a co-founder of OpenAI doing a safety AI type of company. There is. So are you saying that you feel like it's a bit of a media play to create this excitement versus the reality? Because I mean, I would like to think that I'm aligned with you.
Yeah, no. What I'm saying is that I suggest that they have that some of these proclamations about how big the consequences could be, including the risk, are sincere, and they have some understanding of that this is not just another cool technology. And in fact, I think that's a major reason for why they went into this in the first place, that they see this is a really important thing. That doesn't mean that there are not also a lot of pressures operating on them. It's a kind of competition almost, right? Where you need to raise a lot of money to get enough NVIDIA chips to be able to train the next generation model. Otherwise, you just become irrelevant. And, for ambitious people, that is kind of like basically a reductio ad absurdum, right? If some plan leads you to become irrelevant, that means that's not a good plan. And so there are really difficult challenges here. There are commercial pressures, then there are like public opinion pressures, there are like geopolitical pressure, governmental regulatory pressures. Is like a really difficult thing. And all while you're trying to think about all of those things, you also have to actually just make sure the lab functions at an extremely high level on a day-to-day basis. Like, they're all the normal ways that human collective efforts often fizzle out because people get lazy or cliques develop within the company that don't share. That's all the regular stuff, right? So it's really hard. A really hard job, I think, to have.
I mean, it's hard ultimately because humans are incredibly smart, but we probably do the stupidest things.
Yeah, I mean that I guess is a general reason for us like often not achieving success in the world, right? But or do you have a specific thing in mind?
I just think about the fact that you will have companies that do great things, and yet incredibly stupid things happen because of the way in which the system sometimes takes over. And that creates a level of fear when we're talking about super intelligence, when we're thinking about values or cultures. When people even say things like, define the culture, I'm like, well, are you a culture that believes in Sharia law as an example, or one that doesn't? Like, that's going to have a huge ramification on what the system is going to do and play with. Will it understand all of them and the nuance of them?
Yeah, no, what's certainly true is that you could have people who are like really smart, maybe individually rational, but the system is such that it creates incentives that lead to behavior that is not in the global common interest. And we see that, like, just consider like arms races and wars that nations fight against one another. I mean, it would be better if we just had peace and settled our differences according to some agreed rules or laws, right? Rather than settle them by whoever like spends the most on money and sends enough young men to the front line and then kill the most of the other. That seems like not the optimal way of resolving our disagreements. But so far we haven't managed to.
If AI sees that as the answer, then that's the answer it will create at scale potentially. I mean, that's the other thought here, is it will do as programmed and then go down its own path, which potentially might not be positive.
I mean, it might perceive, if it were in a similar situation, it might perceive the same reasons that human decision makers perceive in those situations. That there are these kind of security dilemmas, and it can be hard to coordinate one's way out of them. I think still we have come quite a significant distance as a sort of human species since our early start. We had like the largest political unit was like the clan, maybe, and then it grew to the tribe, and then like you had city states or chiefdoms before, and then city states, now nation states. Now we even have some sort of regional entities like the EU or some weak forms of international law and governance, right? Not yet, but we've kind of, if you think about orders of magnitude, we kind of climbed most of those, like from the largest unit being 50 people or so, now up to the largest unit being like maybe 1 billion people. And we only have sort of one more step until you have a kind of
unified,
some form of global, singleton.
Yeah. So before I'm going to be respectful of your time. Deep Utopia, you create this concept of an ideal life, and I love this idea of the solved world. If you think about it now, it's been written, it's published, it's out in the world. What's your level of confidence in terms of that you solved for the solved life? Do you think that it in the end gave us just many more questions to think about, or do you feel like now, as you're seeing things unfold a little bit more, there's more of a there?
Yeah, it's not a book really about answers so much as it is a book about questions, and in particular helping the reader. They can make up their own mind about all of these things, but they're hard to get into view if you just sit down. Let's just think about what ultimately has value, or what I would want if I had no instrumental limitations. Like, it's hard even to get that question clearly into focus. And so this book hopefully helps people actually. It's also like, aside from that philosophy, it's also like it's a bunch of other things. So there's like kind of, there are elements of fiction embedded there, fictional characters that have conversations. There's a little sort of um, poking fun of academia a little bit,
As I
and
said, there's great
it
humor and great writing. Yeah.
and it really ultimately trying to convey a spirit, a mindset almost of approaching these things, which is, I'm imagining that at some point, if things go well, there will have to be some group of people who try to figure out what we actually want from the future. Like, whether this is like, a small group of people in an AI company, or if it's like a country, or maybe some sort of humanity-wide deliberative process. But somebody somewhere will have to make up their mind actually about what kind of future do we create with these amazing AI tools. And that's a really hard thing to figure out. But it would be useful, it seems to me, to have some kind of preparatory reading when you're going into that great deliberation, to help put you in the right mind, like a kind of a frame of generosity, playfulness, willingness to take ideas seriously, and let them explore them and weigh them. And that's really ultimate. It's like a kind of an intellectual attitude that I'm hoping the book can convey. And but because I think that if we approach the future with that attitude, I'm more optimistic about it ultimately having a good outcome.
Yeah. And I was thinking a lot about what Kevin Kelly wrote and what technology wants, and then thinking as I was reading Deep Utopia that it's great. Now, what do we want? Because if it's right or true, we're going to have to get there. Before we go, Nick, tell me the one thing that made you think differently.
Well, it seems sort of I don't know, maybe I think, as long as I remember, I'm not sure there wasn't a particular thing that did. I did discover the world of learning only at the, like, I think when I was 15. Before that, I sort of hated school, and I didn't pay attention to books or stuff like that, because to me that was the kind of thing we did in school. And then I discovered, as it were by chance, that there is actually a whole big world of learning and idea and art and science and literature, very different from the thing we were taught in school. And then I sort of went that way and took responsibility for my own. So I guess that one. But I think even before that, it always seemed to me that a lot of people were wrong about a lot of things.
Yeah.
So I don't know what that is. If that's some early upbringing, or if it's like just some nature that one has that predisposes one to try. I mean, I don't believe in contrarianism for the sake of having different opinions from everybody else, but trying to think for yourself, and not assuming that just because people are sort of mouthing various opinions that those are necessarily true. Like look at the world, like try to think from first, like how what's actually the case here, not like what's normal thing that is said in this situation, but like try to figure out what's actually the case, and then you can figure out what to say from there. Which add like an extra loop of mental effort. Like, it's easier just to kind of absorb what's the normally done and said thing, and then go with that. But it does open up new avenues as well for intellectual exploration and creativity and invention.
I love that. Well, the new book is called Deep Utopia. I don't think it should be read unless you also read Superintelligence, which was another phenomenal book. You've got other books and writings. Let people know where they can find out more about your work and your thinking, Nick.
Well, nickbostrom.com. I have an old school web homepage where I have all my writings and stuff.
And we'll see a Nick AI at some point on that, I'm sure. But yeah.
Perhaps.
Thanks so much for your time, Nick.
Thank you, Mitch.